All right, so how did you discover philosophy? What made you think, philosophy is what I want to spend my life doing?
Well, it's as I'm sure it has been for many people, it's a product of not wanting to do something else. So I went to college specifically to study pre-law, and I was going to be a lawyer. And I was told that majoring in philosophy would be a good idea for that, so I double majored in philosophy and history. But the very first philosophy course I took, it was a slap across the face. I realized that this was really a challenge to me, and it was a challenge that I loved. And so, but once I graduated from college, I still was intending to go to law school. And then I actually worked at a law firm as a word processor for 2 years. And when I saw that they had bathrooms and showers there that they intended for the lawyers to use because they were supposed to be sleeping there and working 17, 18-hour days, and everybody I talked to was just basically pushing commas around and seemed miserable. I said, this is not the life for me. So I looked around and decided to go to the graduate school in something that I really did love, which was philosophy.
So what was the first issue that really sort of engaged you?
Well, I wanted to do applied ethics. I wanted to explore topics like abortion and public permissibility, legality of pornography, and so I was interested in a number of applied issues. But I quickly realized once I got to graduate school that there were a lot of theoretical issues that I knew nothing about that seemed to ground the work that was being done in applied ethics. And so I got more abstract and am finally starting to work my way out of that back into some more applied realm. But that's what I had wanted to do, and to do that I realized there was a lot of background theoretical work that needed to be done if I wanted to do a good job at it.
Yeah, you pretty soon. I think that's the sign of someone good at this stuff is when they realize how much there is to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's whenever a student thinks that this is pretty easy and there's very little to be said that you realize, okay, you're missing, it's passing you by.
That's right.
But when you are confronted with the enormity of things, that
So there are two reactions one might have. One is that you have to realize how much more work there is to do, and you plunge
quit.
into it. The other is to quit. Yes. So there's that temptation often.
Okay, so what was your dissertation about?
My dissertation was on personal identity. And so I had become very intrigued by that when I had a great professor named Greg Kafka.
Everybody who I know who knew him seems to worship the guy.
He was just a wonderful man. He died far too soon. He was in the first year of my dissertation as the advisor. He died, and that's when Gary Watson stepped in to help me out. But he had revealed to me the stuff that Derek Parfit had been doing in Reasons and Persons, and I just fell in love with it. It was also related to my interest in applied ethics, because what Derek Parfit does in part 3 of that magisterial Reasons and Persons is to explore some applied ethical. There it is. I've got it. I'm right within arm's distance as well. And what he does is to explore issues of abortion, responsibility, desert, compensation. These are applied issues, but through the lens of the more theoretical exploration of personal identity. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so the dissertation was on personal identity as it pertains to various of our more specific practical concerns.
Yeah, and that seems to have been the way that you sort of started out, was writing in personal identity, but it pretty quickly bled over into ethics.
Yeah.
Here's your broad view book, Personal Identity and Ethics. But before you get into the ethical stuff, how would you summarize the state of the field of philosophy of personal identity? Because, when I entered graduate school, it was just after Parfit. And for a while there, it looked like Parfit had kind of, capped it off. It was like there were all these problems with the Lockean view, and Parfit came along with this totally radical response. I mean, in some sense, replying to the problems with the Lockean view, in another sense, saying, well, but why, why should we care about personal identity anyway? But it seems like recently, in the past decade and a half, there's a whole new burgeoning of the field. Would you say that's right? Or?
I think that's right to an extent. So what we've got is some very smart people responding with a biological criterion of identity, which is intended to, I wouldn't say refute the challenge of Parfit, but basically to deflect it. And so to say that what matters for people is a psychological relation, so something pertaining to a kind of psychological criterion of identity, and that captures a lot of our practical concerns that are person-related. But when it comes to the metaphysics of our identity, then what we are is essentially biological creatures. And so what constitutes our identity, our preservation of our identity across time is just biological continuity. And so there's something deeply attractive about that to me. It seems right. But the reason I say I'm not sure how burgeoning it is that we are, in a way, there's a kind of stalemate that's still at work between the two big criteria of identity. And so you still have people who are holding on to a kind of psychological view, Harold Noonan, and to some extent Lynn Rudder Baker, but and then you have and Jeff McMahon he's an interesting kind of hybrid, and then Eric Olson and others, Paul Snowden, holding to this biological criterion. And there are some interesting exchanges that are going back and forth between them, but to my mind, many of the issues have been settled to my satisfaction. That is to say, I think there's something like a biological view of identity, of metaphysical identity, that's correct, because I think that all of the relevant ethical and practical concerns are utterly independent from questions of our metaphysical numerical identity. The one exception to this is the very recent work by Maria Schechtman, which I think does advance the debate in a really interesting way, and I'm looking forward. I'll be teaching her book this fall, but I think that and you've got it right there. Good for you.
Well, I was she was the previous interview.
Oh, that has the best title of a book in a while.
Now, I said to one of my students, the subtitle should be ooh 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 ooh. But
yeah, she was stunned that OUP let that go forward, but I think it's such a great title. But what she's doing is exactly what I think is probably the next natural and maybe endpoint step. Although I should never say that talking to other philosophers, but it's to say that look, there is something very right about our identity as organisms, but it doesn't capture the kind of special object that we are that's distinct from animals. And we are human beings, so it's a kind of anthropological view of our identity. Some of us become persons, sure, but there are identity conditions that must attach to people who aren't full-fledged persons with the full-fledged psychological capacities that we've got, that may not achieve the capacities for responsibility and such, but nevertheless are the object of a whole range of our practical concerns. So to the extent we're looking for the object that perseveres across time, we need to look at human beings in their full anthropological glory. And so I think it's a beautiful theory. To my mind, it's probably, that's the one. That's the one, I think.
Okay, I'll let her know. I gotta say, I had to take over a metaphysics class because Nathan Oaklander, who was our metaphysics guy, philosopher of time, retired. And I understand from the point of view of metaphysics these issues, but it just didn't seem to me that this Olson tries to make this the central issue, and it seems to me it's a parallel issue. And the issues that we really care about are, the things that we say what matters, the responsibility issues and things like that. So yeah, I think that actually you can have both of these sort of running parallel, and they're kind of talking at cross purposes. I mean, Olson's argument about the two thinkers, you know, who is it that's too many thinkers? Who is it thinking, the person or the animal? I don't see the knockdown force of that. I don't see. I don't know. What do you think?
So I agree with you on that. I've always found that to be taken by some to be a knockdown argument, and I'm not sure that it is. It's a kind of appeal to oddness argument, and I'm not sure how much force those kinds of things have. I mean, yeah, the idea is that you've got a person and an animal sitting there, so right there, I'm looking at a person and an animal. They're both obviously thinking, and isn't that odd? And yeah, there's a kind of puzzle there, but I'm not sure what force I'm supposed to take from that. But I think that the arguments in favor of the biological criterion or a more human-oriented criterion are supposed to be cumulative. And so we've got that kind of argument, but that you have to couple that with the appeal to the argument about surely I was a fetus once, and I would be someone in a persistent vegetative state. That's certainly, the way we talk anyway, is certainly committed to something like that. And so we have to take that seriously as well. There are ways of, responding to both of these arguments, I think, on behalf of the psychological continuity theorist. But there is also a kind of force to our being continuous with the rest of the animal kingdom, and that there are that the kinds of identity conditions that are going to apply to non-human animals, you would think would apply to us as well. Now, of course, there are going to be added wrinkles to that, but the added wrinkles, I think, are the higher consciousness that gives rise to the various kinds of practical concerns we've got. But that's where I want to come in and say, okay, those we can treat separately, because they're actually not grounded on identity at all. They're grounded on a variety of other relations. So that's why I'm perfectly happy to grant the metaphysical identity theory to the biological theorist, or to someone like Sheckman with a more human-oriented theorist. But nevertheless, I don't think that the relations that the metaphysical identity relation that they're pointing to is what captures the variety of our practical concerns.
So if an undergraduate came up to you and said, "Will science let me live forever?" what would you say?
So, no, no, you need to give up on that. But you might be able to get something that is, to borrow a Parfitian phrase, just as good as ordinary survival. You might get the persistence of certain kinds of psychological relations that will enable various of your practical concerns, like anticipation or self-concern of a sort, that might be grounded if, let's say, the singularity comes and we've all become one with the Borg, or however that's supposed to work.
Well, what was it? To paraphrase Woody Allen, I don't want to live on through my clones. I want to live on in my apartment.
Yes. So there is that, and I think he said, I don't want to live on through my work.
Right.
Yeah, there is that aspect to it, but to the extent that there is some kind of sufficient persistence of say your first person perspective somehow, or some entity who seems to remember all your thoughts and experiences, and they were caused in the right way, then that may be sufficient to ground some concerns that we have.
So they get my endowment. They get the money I buried in the backyard.
They might, yes.
Okay. All right. What is so amazing about P.F. Strawson's Freedom and Resentment?
So, as I say in the preface of my book,
There's also this one.
Yes, that's right.
Entirely about freedom and resentment.
Freedom and resentment. I have often called it the greatest philosophical article of the 20th century.
And that's your book?
Yeah, and I have colleagues who make fun of me for this, and maybe you will too.
You're a fanboy.
Yes, I am. It's really what got me into the realm of the philosophy that I have pursued for the last 10 or so years.
When I was, I'm sorry, I just got a
Go
little
ahead.
anecdote. When I was starting as an undergraduate, the introductory lecture to everybody doing politics, philosophy, and economics, which was my degree, was given by Strawson, and it was the most boring lecture I have ever encountered. So you're lucky that that didn't happen to you. He was a little old, and he
Yeah.
had rather a flat delivery, so it probably wasn't his fault.
Well, what I think is special about this article is that it was a complete game changer, and we throw that word around occasionally, but this was a genuine game changer for the way philosophy of action and moral responsibility and freedom had been done. In that respect, it's like Rawls' theory of justice, which utilitarianism had been the story of the day until Rawls tried to resurrect a certain kind of Rousseauian Kantian view of political liberalism. For theorists at the time working in free will and moral responsibility, there were just two options, and it was a kind of compatibilism about freedom and responsibility and freedom and determinism that said that the two are compatible, and so what we're doing when we're responding to people with these responsibility responses, like resentment and punishment and so forth, is really just a kind of social efficacy. We're punish somebody, and to that extent, it's going to change the way they think in the future. It's going to deter other people from engaging in these kinds of things. But determinism can be true. It can be completely, their behavior could be completely determined, but that's okay. And on the other hand, you have people saying, well, no. In order for you to deserve punishment, it's got to be the case that you are an agent that is outside the realm of natural event causation. And so these are the only two options. And what Strawson did was present what I think is a genuinely compatibilist view of responsibility. That is that it doesn't matter whether or not determinism or indeterminism is true. It doesn't even matter if we have no clue what determinism is. Instead, by paying attention to our natural human practices with one another, we can see the sorts of things that we are committed to in these responsibility practices, and to question that from outside of the realm of the practices by saying, are they justified? If determinism is true or false, is just the wrong kind of question to ask. So it was revolutionary in that it moved forward a kind of stalemated debate about the relation between freedom and determinism in a very valuable way, and also I think was extremely valuable. It took very seriously a kind of Humean approach to responsibility by paying attention to the real psychological details of the way in which we interact with one another. And so I think a lot of people have found that very refreshing, very insightful, and so it has become certainly the most cited article in this field by far.
Which is kind of odd, because when I think of Strawson, I think of him as a philosopher of language.
Yeah.
I think of his major article as On Referring or something like that.
Yeah.
And he didn't really make many forays. It's basically twice that he addressed this issue. It also seems to me that it's an article that it's one of those things where I'm not so sure that it was seen as so revolutionary at the time. It seems like it's grown in, people have said, oh, look what he did back then. It's like a hit. It got to the top 10, but now it's like 20 years later, suddenly it was number one.
Yeah, that's a nice analogy. It was not cited very much for 20 or so years after its publication. Jonathan Bennett wrote a fairly influential article about it around 1980, I think, and called Accountability, and a few others referred to it. Gary Watson did an interpretive essay on it, I think, in the when was this? Late 80s, 88 probably. And after that, it started gaining a lot more attention. I don't know what the precise spark was, but it was a kind of, maybe it's early social media or something. I mean, you've got to see this thing. But you're exactly right. And there's a biography of Strawson that doesn't even mention his work in Freedom and Resentment. It's all the metaphysics and other things that he had done. He had said, actually, that you're right. He only wrote 2 articles on ethics and responsibility, and basically said, this is all I have to say on it. I don't think it's as hard or as interesting as the work that I've focused my attentions on and in other realms. And Lucy Elias has actually said that he told her that he wrote both of those articles in ethics, including Freedom and Resentment, in one draft.
Right.
Yeah,
Which
Madniker explains a lot.
Yeah, it kind of helps. I mean, if you want a paper that people will go back to again and again, don't be too clear, Mm-hmm. Allow for plenty of interpretation. And it does seem to me that part of the paper seems rather dated and of its time, like the stuff about determinism. And that seems to be the stuff that people don't really talk about so much, like the soft determinist versus the hard determinist. It's as if people don't really care about the freedom part, they care about the resentment part. They care about what seems to be influential is his talk about reactive attitudes and his saying it's a pity that people don't talk about the moral sentiments anymore. And people said, well, we shall.
Yes, exactly. But you run the risk of saying that, backtrack a little bit. I think the respect in which the features that you're pointing to might be dated for some people is a direct function of that article. So I think that there were lots of people who were convinced by both that and Harry Frankfurt's early work on alternate possibilities that, maybe the freedom or the metaphysics of freedom matters less here than the practices of moral responsibility and the attitudes that we have there. And so, now that's not to say there are plenty of people who are still interested in the metaphysics of freedom and doing really interesting work and are interested in trying to, reconstruct the Strawsonian argument in a way that works, because lots of people think that it doesn't work. But as I say, for many, that doesn't matter. That if we've turned and we focused on the moral sentiments, the reactive attitudes, that's where the real action's at. Yeah,
it certainly gave people the license to talk about responsibility without discussing the metaphysics of freedom.
Exactly.
It's funny, there's such a disconnect between various subspheres of philosophy. So, for example, if you do philosophy of religion at all, you've got to have libertarian, it's taken as a given that you've got to have libertarian free will, or you can't have morality or love or anything like that. I mean, I don't know if that's because of the issue of the problem of evil or whatever, but that's just taken as given, that determine it, you must have libertarian free will. And so you cannot have responsibility or any kind of moral value without that.
That's right.
Whereas there's this, if you're doing ethics, I mean, we advertised for a post here in ethics, and that's how I know how popular Strawson's article is, because everybody was talking about Strawson. It's like, wow, this didn't happen when I was in graduate school.
Yeah. That wasn't the case when I was in graduate school either. It really was. I discovered it and its value, I think, several years after. But you're right about the appeal, the necessity of libertarianism in certain subdisciplines.
And that's just taken as a given. That's taken as, who would question that?
Yeah. And part of it is that many people, I don't want to generalize too much about.
Go on.
But there are going to be many philosophers of religion who are going to be concerned about what Galen Strawson called ultimate responsibility, which has to do with, which is going to lean heavily on your desert. The desert of hell, for example, is going to be, that's an eternity of punishment. So there better be some serious desert there, and that's with one S. And so for that to be the case, that's heavy-duty kind of desert. It's what Dirk Perelroom calls desert in the basic sense, that you could, just for an action or for a series of actions, it would be appropriate to throw you in hell for all of eternity. Then you've got to have a very robust kind of freedom, and it's got to be contra-causal. Yeah, that's right. I think that's what's driving that. But
yeah, although of course, if you have a compatibilist bent, I think it seems to me that if you're British, you're a compatibilist, or certainly, Hume, Mill, Locke, all these guys. And certainly it's deep in the core of my being that I don't get how contra-causal seems to me to undermine that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, your more recent stuff. Now, yeah, let's segue. So you start out in personal identity, and now your new book, Responsibility from the Margins, is entirely about responsibility. What was the segue? What drew you from one to the other? Because there certainly is an overlap for you. So how'd that happen?
So it's in part the writing of the first book on personal identity and ethics, and one chapter in there is on responsibility. And I remember struggling at the time with how to say what I wanted to say about responsibility, and I realized that there was a range of issues that needed to be discussed. And so I started to gradually get into responsibility. My thesis advisor was Gary Watson, and it's when you have Gary Watson as an advisor, it seems like he's cornered the market on the truth. That's how it seemed to me, especially as
never write a dissertation on what your advisor does.
That's right.
Either you just agree with them, or what can you do?
That's right. Or the minor little janitorial work. Yeah. And so I wasn't interested in that. But gradually I started to see that there was a little room, and it was partially as a discovery of the Strawson. A fuller discovery of the Strawson article, and I had started to teach the Strawson article, but also to teach issues in responsibility more generally. And so I then became very interested in marginal agents. And by marginal agents, I mean people who we think have a kind of a foot in and a foot out of the moral responsibility community. And I really found myself drawn in by the case of the psychopath. And so there was a literature that had begun around this time. This is the early to mid-aughts. And I was fascinated by this literature. I won't say any more than this, but a psychopath entered my life in a certain way. And so I became personally invested in this literature, and thinking my way through the issue of, well, is this kind of person who has some clear incapacities, but who is also clearly seems cruel and manipulative, responsible? And from there, I started to think about, well, what about other kinds of marginal agents, those with intellectual disabilities, those with individuals with autism? And so there was a paper that I wrote in 2007 where I tried to explore some of these issues for accountability. And as I thought more and more about it, it became clear to me that what was being forced upon me was a kind of a pluralism about responsibility, that there are multiple types of responsibility, and our responses to these marginal agents, I think, reveal that to us. So it started with the thoughts about personal identity and responsibility. As you say, that's still there, in part because one realm of responsibility has to do with attributing certain character traits to us, and character traits require a certain kind of persistence across time. And so the issues are absolutely related. I was also, this is going to sound bizarre, but I was intrigued by something that I wrote in the earlier book that I looked back on that had to do with, said in the case of responsibility, what we're doing is negotiating in certain cases whether responsibility obtains. So one kind of case is to think about, brother and sister sitting at Thanksgiving 20 years after the brother has pushed the sister out of a tree when they were, 7 or 8 years old, and she still blames him for that. And he says, "Oh, come on, that wasn't me," or that. And so and he's not trying to escape responsibility. He just wants to say, "Oh, come on, I moved on.
Move
I'm
on.
not that kind of person anymore." And I wondered, how do we resolve this issue? And the thought is, well, maybe we're talking past one another in a way, or that she's appealing to one kind of responsibility, he's appealing to a different kind of responsibility. And so it was those kinds of thoughts that raised the issue. Maybe we've got a multiple kinds of responsibility at issue here.
Yeah. Now, what's distinctive about a Strawsonian approach is it says, let's focus on what we do. Let's look at what we do. Let's look carefully at, the feelings that we have towards other people. Now, of course, a critic of that approach is going to say, well, we're stupid, right? We don't know what we're doing. We're wrong about so much. Why should something so important as responsibility? Certainly, if you're in the philosophy of religion and you're looking from a God's eye point of view of what people deserve, why should we care about these kind of responses? Because, for example, you see people react totally inappropriately, it seems, to children or to autistic individuals. They have the same feelings. They do resent them. But we want to say, yes, you have those feelings and they're misplaced. And the reason why they're misplaced is because they objectively don't have the capacities that are required. So isn't there, and I'm pushing this as a critic of this approach. I'm not saying I'm a critic of the approach, but a critic of the approach would obviously say you shouldn't start with the feelings.
Right. So that's absolutely the right kind of a worry to raise here. And so there are many things that need to be said. One is that for a Strawsonian theory to be at all plausible, you can't just be doing ethnography. I'm not just surveying the landscape of our responses and we say, and now we're going to build the contours of responsibility directly from those responses. There's got to be some normativity built in there. So we can say of someone exactly as you put it, well, no, you're just wrong to respond in that way to a child or somebody who is severely intellectually disabled or autistic. So how do we do that, but hold on to starting with the responses and the practices? Well, one argument in favor of starting with the responses is that distinct from many other fields in philosophy, I think the study of moral responsibility is so inexorably intertwined with our responses that you've got to appeal to them on some level, and some fundamental methodological level. So I've often lamely joked that you can't spell responsibility without response. But in this case, it's really true that when we're theorizing, we're trying to put together a theory of responsibility. The way we do so is by appealing to cases and then leaning on our responses to those cases. How would we feel if somebody did this, but nevertheless they were under severe stress, say? So I think you've got to appeal to the responses. Now the question is, do we take a Strawsonian approach where the responses are where we in fact start, and then we build up our theory from appeal to the responses, or do we use the responses as a kind of an epistemic guide to the true facts about responsibility that are in fact response independent? I try to stay neutral on that question in the book and just want to say that regardless of which way you go, you've got to take the responses seriously. Now, we don't just take the responses seriously. It can't be that we just take a poll and find out how people in fact respond. Instead, we've got to have some account of what makes the responses fitting, what makes them appropriate, what are the correctness or incorrectness conditions of those responses. And to do that kind of work, it's difficult And that's actually the project that I'm working on now. But I think what we need is simply that there are certain kinds of responses that we recognize generally to have a certain kinds of constraints on them. And if we can't precisely identify, what exactly those constraints, those normative constraints are, we can get a rough picture of them, and that may be enough to enable us to move forward and theorize adequately about responsibility.
Well, what would you say if someone said, but wait a minute, by using that very term fitting, aren't you implying, well, that the most important standard is the objective one? It's fitting when they have the appropriate features. So it's the features that come first, not our response to them.
Yeah, so this is exactly the project I'm working on now, and I'm very excited about it. So I want to run an analogy and response to humor. So what is it that makes something funny? Think about the variety of things that counts as funny. So we've got slipping on a banana peel, a pun, a good pun, a 10-year-old boy, two 10-year-old boys farting, two 10-year-old boys laughing about the fart that they've just. All of these things are hilarious. It can be somebody falling down. It can be a well-crafted joke. It can be people's bad reaction to a well-crafted joke. So I'm thinking of The Onion had some headlines about Harry Potter being Satanist, and that was hilarious in and of itself. But then what's also hilarious is that there were thousands of people who took that seriously and are forwarding it to their friends and telling them not to read the Harry Potter books. That is hilarious too. Okay, so we have this huge range of things that we find funny. Now, what unites them all under the rubric of the funny? Well, there are a variety of theories, and I'm just going to really gloss over that they all have counterexamples. There, I've said it. And so one plausible response to the fact that they've all got these kind of counterexamples is that, well, what unites them all under the rubric of the funny is that they are all just things that we humans tend to laugh at, tend to respond to with amusement. Now, not everything that we respond to with amusement is funny, and some of the things we don't respond to with amusement are in fact funny. But we've got ways of talking with one another about this, where we're appealing, where people have bad senses of humor, people have good senses of humor. And so, but this is a matter of some negotiation with one another, trying to identify what it is that in fact is appropriate to respond to with humor. Now, here's the way that structure would go. We've got what counts as funny is fixed, is determined by our range of amused responses, suitably constrained in some way. You've got to have a good sense of humor, right? You've got a sophisticated sense of humor and certain kinds of understandings of the world, blah, blah, blah. And then what that kind of sensibility responds to is what counts as the funny. Now, that has an objective status at that point, so that when you fail to laugh at what that thing is, I can say, but it's got that thing. And when I appeal to that thing, it sounds response independent. But what put that thing in the realm of the funny in the first place was that it was the sort of thing to which our sophisticated humor sensibility responds to with amusement. The exact same story is going to go with responsibility. So take something like anger, which we think is a blaming response when it's constrained to other agents. So the way this story would go is that the sorts of things, so think of the variety of things to which we tend to respond with anger. So it can be, somebody stepping on your foot, somebody looking at you in a certain way, somebody treating you with condescension, somebody harming their child.
Somebody saying disinterested when they mean uninterested.
That's going to be a clever kind of attempt at a counterexample. I get you, Simon. But so there are a variety of things here, and so what unites them all under the rubric of the anger-worthy, of the blame-worthy? Well, there are various theories. There are reasons responsiveness theories, there are deep self theories, there are quality will theories, and I think each of them has certain counterexamples in the same way that the various objective theories about humor do. And I think the way to go is a response-dependent route. That what unites them all is that these are the things to which we and having a suitably informed sensibility respond to with anger. So
maybe you could say that what you're advocating is kind of a reflective equilibrium. Like we identify, we're going to say, okay, we're going to examine humor. So what's funny? Well, the thing that explains why we as humans have a concept of funny in the first place is the fact that we laugh at things. So you can say that's got to be the starting point. Now, it can turn out that we can then say, okay, we find out that there's nothing that they all have in common, but there are interesting core groups. And we can say, well, that's the real funny. And it's not, funny is not everything we laugh at. The real funny is what is the core, the important core. So we can say, although we were led to find this core by starting with the laughter, with our response, and we can sort of bounce back and forth between that. And then you can say, but the starting place came with the laughter, came with the response. Is that what you would advocate?
That's not what I would advocate. I think that's a more plausible view than what I advocate. Okay. But I stick to the more radical response dependent view. I think the corrections that we engage in, now maybe this is more, let's see, it depends on how you fill in that reflective equilibrium view. Maybe these are more compatible than I'm thinking that they are, but the kinds of corrections that we do are not corrections toward a core. Even though some people have thought this. So here's an example that Michael McKenna gives that is meant to cut against a response-dependent view of responsibility. That we used to think that dyslexic children, we didn't know what dyslexia was, and so we thought that they were lazy, and so they got lots of blame for not working hard enough in school and so forth. And then we discovered they've got this condition, dyslexia, and it makes things much harder, and so we changed. We changed our practices so that we don't blame this, or we know that we ought not blame, anyway, dyslexic children. So the thought behind that might be that, what we're doing is engaging in a kind of reflective equilibrium. Maybe we see that we respond to a certain kind of feature of people, but then we're correcting when we find out that these children don't exhibit that feature or something like that. What I would like to say instead is that what we've identified as a pure product of appeal to our responses is something like quality of will. And I think that fractures into multiple ways, but let's say in the case of the dyslexic children, that they didn't exhibit a certain kind of quality of will. That remains fixed. And then we discover certain facts about them. And we realize, okay, they weren't expressing a nasty quality of will or a lazy quality of will. And so the attitudes that we would have thought to be appropriate to quality of will, to their poor quality of will, are no longer fitting. Now that hasn't changed at all what the target of our responses is. Instead, it changes our responses in light of certain empirical facts. So I would want to say that not just the core, but what counts as the range of the responsible, the blameworthy, is entirely a function of our various attitudinal sensibilities. And any corrections that occur are going to be in light of new facts, new empirical facts.
But would you, it seems like you want to say, when you say our responses, you want the responses, one way in which you could say that the responses can be sort of criticized is by focusing on a sort of species level of response. So you could say your response is wrong because it's not the typical human response.
So that seems right to me, and that's why I want to focus on a very distinctive subset of emotional responses that are responsibility-y. And I want them to be, these are the universal human sentiments. So it's anthropocentric, absolutely. It's relative at that level, at the species level.
Like Hume.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so maybe this would be a good time to have you lay out your tripartite theory. Yeah, and, not in, 30 seconds.
Sure, no problem. So Most people, when they are exploring the nature of responsibility and blameworthiness, are appealing to, as Strawson did, a very tiny subset of our responses. And they're usually the triumvirate of resentment, indignation, and guilt, with occasionally gratitude, but mostly focused on the negative and mostly focused on a very small subset. So the first thing to do is to identify there's a much wider range of emotional responses that we have to people's expressions of practical agency, which is what I'm thinking very roughly as the rubric of responsibility. And so these include things like, of course, resentment, indignation, and guilt, but more generally anger, gratitude, esteem, disesteem, approval, disapproval, pride, regret, admiration, disdain, contempt, and the many, many others. Then what I attempt to do is identify the sort of universal syndromes. And it seems to me that there are three distinct categories. And these are pairs. So admiration and disdain, which are universal, and what I'm thinking of pan-cultural here, universal sentiments, admiration and disdain, and in particular, a version of admiration and disdain. So I need to back up and say something very quickly about the nature of emotions. Generally, they have a kind of triple syndrome. They include typically a kind of affect, an associated thought, not a judgment necessarily, but an associated thought, and then most importantly, a motivational impulse. And so I want to define these emotional universal sentiments in terms primarily of their motivational impulse. And so the motivational impulse that's definitive of admiration of a particular sort of other agents, namely, is a kind of motivation to self-improvement or emulation. Disdain, again, is a kind of improving myself or not being like that motivation. That's one pair. A second kind of pair is regret and pride. These are first personal. I can talk about that aspect of it if you want, but these are universal sentiments. And regret, for example, is its motivational impulse. It goes to trying to change my judgmental policies in the future. So I regret something where I made a poor decision or made a bad judgment.
Now, what's different between those two pairs is the first, admiration and disdain, seems to be other-regarding, although it could be self-regarding too, whereas the other one seems solely self-regarding.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's the one to focus on, but there are third personal analogs that go to, because I think the first personal form of it gets at something that I think is really interesting, namely we're targeting a particular kind of judgment about the worth of various reasons. But I think there are third person analogs of that, approval and disapproval, which goes to the quality of other people's judgments. The third kind of universal sentiment is anger, and its pair is gratitude. So each of these is, I think, targeting a different quality of will. The admiration and disdain pair targets quality of character. People's character traits are being evinced by various of their expressions of attitudes and actions.
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
Yes, could you say a little bit more about character? Because it seems like character is a term that gets thrown around a lot. Again, in philosophy of religion, I encountered that it's used in a very specific way. So, for example, your character is specifically made up, or certainly in one area of philosophy of religion, your character is something that's made up by your free choices. And it wouldn't include things like tasting ice cream or anything like that.
Right. Right. Well, I don't think it would include taste and ice cream as well, but I don't think it's a function of your free choices either. So what I'm doing is taking seriously the emotional responses, and once I've defined the relevant syndrome, it's to other agents, and it has this particular motivational profile, and then seeing what types of thing in an agent are the targets of the emotional response in question. And while we may well admire people plenty for their free choices, whatever those are, we also, I think, admire or disdain people in virtue of things that are expression of things that they care about that don't have any voluntary component at all. That is to say, things to which they have emotional responses, where there's no voluntary component at all. I recall going to a theater once in Arkansas, and I was seeing the movie What's Love Got to Do with It, which was about the Ike and Tina Turner story. And there were two other people in the theater. They weren't Hell's Angels, but they were from a motorcycle club, and they had it on the back of their jackets. And whenever Ike beat up Tina in that movie, they would just laugh hysterically. Now, there's nothing that seems voluntary about that response, but nevertheless is absolutely an evocation of a character trait. So it's those kinds of things I want to include under the rubric of things that are admirable or disdainable, in that case, contemptible, right?
And presumably irrespective of their cause.
So I'm not... I see what you're suggesting. Yes, although this is tricky. So you might have in mind a kind of manipulation case where I implant in you the sudden urge to laugh at the...
Or just the rotten social background, the bad upbringing.
Okay. So those are two different kinds of cases. So if it's like an immediate manipulation, that may not be enough to establish the kind of character trait that I have in mind. So I'm thinking that character traits are generally, persistent. This goes to the identity issue. And so, but to the extent that they have been a persistent part of your life, then yeah, it doesn't matter if they've come from a poor formative circumstance or great formative circumstances.
So you can say it's not his fault that he's an asshole, but he is a colossal asshole.
That's it. That's right. And this is true. I mean, there are various predications we make of people. An asshole is one of them, and that can be absolutely true of somebody.
No, I think Frankfurt's next paper should be on assholes.
Yeah.
So character is to do with your responses, but it's different from your judgment, which is okay. So explain that distinction.
Right. So when we think of, say, approval or disapproval of what somebody else did, or in the first person case, which I think gets at it more clearly, regret and pride over what I've done. What am I targeting and regretting when I did? As I said before, it's a kind of poor judgment. This may have nothing to do with my character. It's just at that particular time I made a stupid choice, and so I regret that, despite the fact that I generally have a very good judgmental character, if there's such a thing. So what precisely is being targeted there? Well, I make judgments about the worth of various reasons, and not just the worth of various reasons standing apart, but the worth of various reasons relative to other kinds of reasons. And so when I make good judgments, I have a kind of pride. There's a particular kind of pride. When I make poor judgments, there's a regret. And what that does, again, it's defined by my motivational impulse to try to improve my judgmental policies in the future. That's why I think that we can, when we look at that particular kind of motivational tug, we're seeing what the target of the emotional response is.
But if you draw too much of a distinction between character and judgment, I'm not sure why I should regret my poor judgment. Because if, let's say I'm going to assume, and you can correct me on this, or you can argue why you don't think that, but let's say I assume that my character, in some sense, is the real me. Then I made a poor judgment, but it wasn't reflective of my character. It's like free floating or something. Yeah. Unless there's some kind of implication that if I have poor judgment, that reflects poorly on my character, then why should I regret my bad judgment? It's almost like something that happened to me.
So there are. This occupies that middle ground between something that's happened to me and something that is, in fact, reflective on me in a way that might warrant something like shame. So to make the distinctions plausible, there've got to be these pure cases. Now, a lot of times, of course, all of these responses are going to be overlapping in a single way, that my poor judgment does reflect on my character in a way that's also, it reflects poor regard, which is the third kind. But in the pure kinds of cases, I think, you can make a poor judgment that is regret-worthy, but it's very specific to some context, and that it's not reflective of my character overall, but nevertheless is not something that happened to me. So these might be cases, say I come out of the Grateful Dead show and I'm just overwhelmed with
Well,
a lot
right
of
there, you should regret that right there.
well, that could be a reflection on my character. But once I'm there and I'm coming out of this show and I'm overwhelmed with the love and whatever is going on. I've never been to a Grateful Dead show, but I'm just imagining. And so I come out and I hand all my money to the guy that needs a ride or something like that. And then I find that I don't have a ride home. I don't have a way to get home. And so I sheepishly call my wife and say, okay, so here's what I just did.
She says, not again.
Well, if she said that, then that would be grounds for a kind of character attribution. But if this is something, I'm normally very responsible, but my mood was heightened in a way, right? That I just, but but I wasn't incapacitated. That's also
it wasn't just the secondhand smoke.
Yes, that's what I want to make sure we're clear about. Then there's something that I think appropriately regret, but it doesn't implicate my character. So I wouldn't be the appropriate subject of admiration or disdain, right? But nevertheless, approval or disapproval on the part of my wife, regret on my own part.
So it's like when you say, well, that was a stupid thing to do, and someone says, are you calling me stupid? And you say, no.
Yes.
But you did something stupid.
Exactly. That's exactly the distinction I'm trying to capture. Yeah.
Okay, so the first character is the basis of which of your three A's? Attributability.
Yes.
And then judgment is answerability,
That's right.
Which makes sense because judgment is to do with reasons, and that's what you can answer to someone on the basis of reasons.
That's right.
Now, there's this third feature.
Yes. So the third feature is what most people have focused on in talking about responsibility, and it's what I call accountability. It's what many other people have called accountability as well. So I wanted to preserve that label.
It is unfortunate that there are three A's. I kind of wish it was like character responsibility, judgment responsibility, and regard responsibility would have been so much easier.
I completely agree. And so there's this thought, I had the thought, well, I want to preserve the labels that have been used before. It turns out they're all A's. And then I thought, hey, how cool, triple A theory. And then I realized very quickly after that, this is going to be incredibly confusing. So yeah, accountability is just regard. It has to do. It implicates the quality of your regard for other people, other agents. The emotions, the sentiments that are implicated here are anger and gratitude. That's the universal pair. And anger targets poor quality of regard. Gratitude targets good quality of regard. So what does that mean? Quality of regard. It's not judgment. It's not character. Instead, it's a particular kind of perceptual stance that you take or have toward other people. And really what it implicates is whether or not you're taking people seriously. So it's somewhat hard to explain. I'll try to get to it. There are two kinds of regard. There's what I call evaluational regard, and there's emotional regard. And I'll try to illustrate both with examples. So evaluational regard, suppose that I'm thinking about starting to jackhammer my driveway on a Sunday morning at 5 a.m. so I can finish the whole project in one day. My neighbor, I know, works late as a bartender, gets home at 3 o'clock, so okay, there are those facts that are in the air. I'm trying to decide whether or not to start at 5 a.m. Regard, my quality of regard, evaluationally depends on how seriously I take my neighbor's interests, given that they will be affected by my jackhammering. And so the way we typically enable evaluational regard is via empathy. So I take up his perspective. I think, okay, so he's getting in bed, and he thinks, and he wakes up at 5 a.m. and hears this horrible jackhammering and is just absolutely outraged by it. And it's because it matters to him to be able to sleep in on a Sunday morning. All right. So typically I will then be able to see the worth that he attaches. Now this is going to sound insane. This is not the way, this can't possibly be the way we do things, but I'm just spelling out what I think is a very compressed and quick process and is often automatic for well-versed moral agents. But I just want to pick apart all of the features here. So I see from his perspective that he assigns worth to being able to sleep in, and to the extent that I can see that and then I return to my own perspective, that becomes for me reason-ish. And what I mean by that is it's a putative reason, the fact that this really matters to him, it's among his interests to be able to sleep in. And so then I take that, to take him seriously is to take that reason-ish fact seriously, and so I may judge then that reason is, that fact is in fact a reason that I need to take more seriously, and then I may judge that it is serious enough for me to put off the project for a few hours on Sunday morning. So that's evaluational regard. It's to be able to see someone else's interests, the things they find worthwhile, as reason-ish in my own deliberations. The second one is much more straightforward. My wife comes home from work. She's been emotionally traumatized by her boss, let's say, and so she's telling me this story, and she's emotionally wrought, and I don't respond with any kind of emotional response. I say, there, dear. I say the sort of right things, but I don't respond in a simpatico fashion with her emotionally. I think I'm a fitting target of a sort of anger in that case. And that's because I failed to emotionally regard her. So the two kinds of regard, evaluational regard, more colloquially, we think of failures of that sort as being inconsiderate. It is failing to consider the interests of somebody else. Emotional disregard is insensitivity. Okay.
Yeah. Now, in the boss case, suppose you're torn. Suppose you are also a boss. And you can kind of see his or her point of view. Let's say it's a him in this case. So you can say, kind of see his point of view, and that's sort of why you're not responding in the way that she wants. Now, are you wrong not to override that? Are you wrong not to just to have this automatic response of getting in rage? Oh, yeah, no. In other words, is it your failure to put yourself entirely in her shoes? But because I think that happens a lot when people say, actually, I kind of see, and that's going to make the person you're talking to even more angry when you get all reasonable with them.
That's right. So fortunately, this is not a work in normative ethics, so I have no answer for you. But what I'm trying to do is figure out what is going on when she responds with anger here, and to the extent that we think that it's fitting. Then what has to be targeted is my emotional insensitivity. Now, it may be that is tempered by my thoughts, my taking up the perspective of her boss and so forth. And so these are the kinds of things that we're negotiating when we talk to one another or when we get angry at one another, where we think that the anger is unreasonable. But it may also be a function of my ability to step into the perspective of the boss's shoes evaluationally. And so here we've got a really interesting case where my evaluational regard for her boss is in tension with my emotional regard for her, and that's the kind of torn that I'm feeling. Because my regard can split in a couple of different directions.
It's like it becomes a question of loyalty. Then it seems like your empathy, your empathy shouldn't be applied to her boss because all your empathy should be applied to her, and you're being disloyal in taking his point of view.
Yes, and this is the way in which I think the tripartite theory, if it's right, can capture all the nuances of these deeply interpersonal exchanges. Because what she may realize is that I'm perfectly, my failure to be emotionally simpatico with her is perfectly appropriate with respect to her emotional trauma, but it reveals a character trait such that she may have kind of contempt for me or disdain for me in virtue of the fact that I've reflected some objectionable character trait. And so there is this kind of ambivalence that we have in these interpersonal exchanges where the multiple types of multiple types of responsibility are at war with one another.
Now, is all of this, is this making responsibility too broad? So is this back to your, you can't spell responsibility without responses? Is this, are you talking, when you have a tripartite theory of responsibility, is this broader than, say, many people mean by responsibility?
It is. And so there is that battle to fight. Most people, as I said, want to just talk about what I'm calling accountability and what they call accountability as well, which is just really about what they think punishment, anger, retributive kinds of emotions. There are a couple of arguments that I want to use to push people in my direction. One is that there are plenty of really smart people, like Tim Scanlon and Angela Smith and Pamela Hieronymi and Matt Talbert, who have pressed for answerability as the only kind of responsibility, and the relevant sorts of responses that we have are much wider than just resentment, indignation, and guilt. For example, for Tim Scanlon, when we blame someone, yes, among those responses might be anger, resentment, and so forth, but also among those responses might be just forming the intention not to deal with this person anymore, or forming the intention not to deal with this person in matters related to the thing that they wronged you on. So somebody breaks a promise to you, well, you just decide, I'm not going to take seriously the promises that he makes anymore, or I'm not going to deal with him in this particular zone. So, and that seems right to me, that there are ways in which we blame people that don't necessarily include the resentment, indignation, guilt triumvirate. And so there, as I say, there are these people who focused on answerability and the kinds of broader range of responses there. And also Gary Watson has written a very influential piece called The Two Faces of Responsibility, in which he focuses not just on accountability, but also what he calls attributability, which has to do with these kind of erratatic responses that we've got. There are some people who say, look, I think Julia Driver is one. There are others who say, look, the kinds of erratatic responses you're appealing to, admiration and disdain, yeah, sure, they go to something we'll call moral appraisability, which is what Hume called it, but doesn't go to accountability, and so not genuine responsibility. And my thought there is why? I mean, it seems to me arbitrary to restrict the range of our responsibility responses just to that small group. Jay Wallace even further restricts them just to indignation and resentment, and doesn't even include the positive kinds of accountability responses like gratitude. And again, this seems to me to be completely arbitrary. What reason do we have to exclude these as among the responses that we have to other people's expressions of practical agency? So I'm urging that we take seriously the broader range, and I think that there's not a reason to restrict them. Now, some people will want to respond to that, well, look, there's some of these responses implicate things that aren't up to us in a way that we think is what the core of responsibility is about. And so I have a variety of things to say about that, which we can talk about. But anyway, I've gone.
Yeah, I mean, your book is called Responsibility from the Margins, and as you say, you think that it's a sort of the key to unlocking responsibility is to look at marginal cases of where we feel ambivalence. If the psychopath, mildly intellectually disabled individuals, and autistic individuals that are ambivalent, we feel ambivalent responses to them, and you want to analyze the ambivalence as, well, maybe we're not getting all of the three, but we are getting one of them. So we want to say that this kind of response is allowable and, defensible, right, even if it's not the other two aren't defensible. So, for example, with the psychopath, you say that a talk that you gave at Flint was from anger to disdain. So you say anger is not justifiable. That implies accountability, and the psychopath is not accountable because of their various deficits. But disdain is appropriate because their character genuinely is flawed, and this is our response to their character.
Right.
So Well, perhaps you could say, why is it that anger is not appropriate for a psychopath, but disdain is? So say a little bit about psychopaths.
So I'll say a little bit about them after saying a little bit more about accountability. So the way we get to uh, uh, genuine regard for other people is it's enabled by empathy. There's evaluational empathy, there's emotional empathy, and that tracks the two kinds of regard. And I think that psychopaths are not accountable in virtue of the fact that they have severe deficiencies, if not complete disabilities, in their empathic capacities. Their emotional incapacities are fairly well known. I mean, they're very dulled for anything other than the most basic emotional responses. They tend not to care about much of anything. And so that they could take up your emotional perspective and feel alongside you in a simpatico way is quite unlikely. Now, I should preface all of these marginal cases by saying that all of them are on a spectrum. And so here I'm talking about a kind of paradigm case of a psychopath who scores over a 30 on the Hare checklist of psychopathy. So somebody who's genuinely psychopathic, and so is really not going to, or full-fledged, I should say, and it's not going to feel emotional empathy. Whether they can feel evaluational empathy is an interesting question, but also I think the answer is no. Whether or not they can take up your perspective is not at question. They, in fact, can take up other people's perspectives. So they've got a theory of mind. They're able to understand what other people are going through. But this is why there's an additional step required for evaluational regard, which is to be able to see others' interests as worthy of pursuit from their perspective. And I think it's that psychopaths can't see. And the reason they can't see that is that they just don't see worth generally. And this comes out in the rampant prudential impairments. So they pursue one thing and then another. They flip from job to job. They make a fortune and then they lose it. They make a fortune and then they lose it. Those who aren't in prison. Or they go to prison, they get out. They go to prison, they get out. And what I think this strongly suggests is that they're incapable of seeing worth in their own pursuits. They see no worth anywhere. And so to the extent they can't judge that others' pursuits have worth either, then they're incapable of the kind of evaluational regard that's required, in my view, for taking other people sufficiently seriously. So if you can't take someone else sufficiently seriously, then anger is just not appropriate. This is reflected in the kind of pointlessness that you might feel in expressing your anger to a psychopath. It's puzzling, it's amusing to them, but it's not something that they can take seriously.
So they never get angry at themselves, presumably.
So there is a kind of anger that they feel, but no, they don't get angry at themselves, from what I understand. But they can get angry at other people, and they do have flashes of anger at other people. So something matters to them, but they only get angry when other people are kind of not taking them seriously in a way, or as seriously as they think they ought to be taken. So they have very strong desires to do things, and if they feel that people are blocking them from being able to do those things, then they have a kind of anger. It's not the kind of anger, I think, that we have towards other agents. So I mistakenly just said when they think others aren't taking them seriously. I don't think that's the right way to describe their kind of anger. I think their kind of anger is towards others as frustrators of their pursuit of goals. It's not towards others as disrespecters of them.
But the biggest frustrator of their goals is them.
Yes, that's true. And they don't get angry at themselves for frustrating their own goals. That's right. So I need to be very precise in my language here, and I've probably been a little too sloppy. If we think that goals involve a kind of assessment of worth, then I don't want to use that term. But I don't want to at all deny that psychopaths have desires, and the desires shape their motivations. It's just that I don't see them as viewing those desires as having any worth in the way that we would judge a pursuit or a goal to have kind of worth. So psychopaths don't have ends. That's maybe the best way to put that. Psychopaths don't have ends. But nevertheless, they do get angry when you block the pursuit of their desire, even though they don't judge it to be worthy of pursuit necessarily. So they don't have an evaluative stance towards anything. And again, this is at the high end of the psychopaths. But nevertheless, they care about things. They care about, namely, the satisfaction of the desires that they happen to have. And so the fact that they care about the satisfaction of those desires, I think, is what explains their anger when those desires are thwarted. But when it comes to themselves, it's just they feel whatever they feel at any particular time. If they've got a desire to do this, then they do it. And if nothing's getting in their way, there's no reason to be angry about it. But given that there's no long-term end that they've got, that they've judged worthy of pursuit, they're not going to be angry at themselves for frustrating that because they don't have such things.
Perhaps their problem is that they're extreme episodics, to use Galen Strawson's term. I mean, maybe you could tie this into personal identity.
Right.
As you say, they seem to get very invested in certain careers. They can be very successful salesmen. You point to a specific example of a guy who made lots of money, but then, bam, it's gone.
Yeah.
So, and if you ask them later, well, do you regret screwing up that? Do you know what they would say? They would say, no, I have no regrets? Or
Yes. There are no regrets.
Well, then, I mean, one way to understand that is to say that they don't invest in that former self, that they don't identify with that former self.
So that's a really interesting point. There's a piece by Gary Watson. It's very recent. I think it's Aristotelian Society, where he's arguing that psychopaths lack a kind of practical identity. And now this is really interesting. I'm wondering if Galen Strawson would, because he thinks he's an episodic, right? Whether he would reject the description.
Thinks GS is.
That's right.
Yeah.
Whether he would reject the notion that he lacks a practical identity if he's genuinely an episodic. Maybe he rejects the coherence of a notion of a practical identity. I'm not sure, but this is a really interesting project to pursue. Because it has been thought by some people that psychopaths are really what Harry Frankfurt called a wanton, that they don't care about themselves, they don't care about anything, they just pursue whatever it is they pursue at the first order desire level. They have no second order reflective desires about them, about those first order pursuits. And that does seem somewhat right to me, although I do want to resist the notion they care about nothing, because I think they care about at least the satisfaction of whatever desires they have at any individual moment, given that they have such strong anger in response to the frustrations of their goal, of their desires.
Do you think that it could turn out that psychopath is like neurotic? It's like a term that will be abandoned when we get better science. Like, do you think neuroscience could show that in fact there aren't really psychopaths as we understand them? Or do you think, are you fairly convinced that psychopath is a natural kind?
It depends. I think what's going to happen is that we're going to see a separation in the psychological literature about.
Okay, so you were saying about psychopathy that psychology is going to be split about it.
Yeah, so I think that, and it's because there are two factors that are relevant to the diagnosis of psychopathy. I mean, it originally was put in place as something to diagnose in trying to identify what it is that led people to be very recidivists as criminals. So it was supposed to, people who scored highly on this test were supposed to, it was going to be able to predict whether or not they would be recidivists. But there are two factors. One is in the Hare checklist. One is a series of behavioral elements, and the other is a series primarily psychological elements. And the latter includes things like lack of empathy, callousness, lack of remorse, lack of regret, these sorts of things. And I think what's going to happen is that the antisocial personality side of it, which is what explains why lots of folks are in fact in prison, is going to be the focus. And that will split off from the factor one features of psychopathy, which are those more psychological features, and the ones that these are the kinds of individuals that philosophers, for example, are more interested in, and they tend to, and those who are very high on the factor one scores, who are callous, lack of emotion, but don't have the behavioral issues, tend to be what they call successful psychopaths, and so are out and about in the world, not in prison yet, anyway. So I think what's going to happen is that they will split, but in that split, it's still going to be a tricky issue whether the factor one psychopaths are going to constitute a natural kind, which was your original question, because it's not entirely clear what kind of person that would predict. So I'm not sure. I think the jury's still out on whether psychopathy is going to last or become, as you say, like the neurotic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering do you think that it'll map onto a part of the brain? Because, as you know, I've just been sitting through a discussion of mirror neurons, which at one point, before Greg Hickok wrote his book, were considered to be like the basis of empathy or something. And maybe the suggestion was that autistic people or psychopaths might have damage in their mirror neurons. But he doesn't think that's going to work for various reasons, but it might turn out that there is some part of the brain. Or do you think that even if there is no part of the brain that it maps onto, it's a I don't know, recognizable enough deficit that we can say yes, that's
I think it's recognizable enough of a deficit that it's very likely that there's a particular part of the brain that it maps onto, and I think like the work of James Blair is honing in on those particular neurobiological features. That there does seem to be a relevant sort of deficit that might be able to, in a unified way anyway, explain many of the factor one features, and so the lack of empathy, the callousness, the shallow emotional affect, the impairments in responding to fear, so they do skin conductance tests, and the things that would frighten most people, there's no real response that they have, or very limited response. So they're looking for ways in which all of these impairments, disabilities are probably going to map onto a particular location or small subset of locations.
Now, I don't know if you watch the BBC show Sherlock, but in one of the early episodes, somebody calls him a psychopath, and he says, "No, I'm a sociopath," or something like that. But you, as far as I understand, that distinction no longer is respected?
It's not really used. Most people have gravitated toward psychopath. It was never entirely clear what the distinction was supposed to be anyway. And at least for psychologists who are using the term, despite the fact that it's not in the DSM-5 yet, it's almost invariably the term is psychopath. So that's what most people are going with now.
Maybe it's like Asperger's versus autistic, which has also disappeared in DSM-5.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay, tell us about, I don't know if you say it this way, NOIR, New Orleans
yes, no
Workshop.
No war, no war.
No war, there you go.
New Orleans Workshop on Agency and Responsibility, yeah. This fall will be the third. We put out an invitation for abstracts for papers in the November of the previous year, and then usually get about 150 abstracts, and from that, 9 are chosen to present. We've got 2 keynote speakers this fall, Julia Driver and Dirk Paraboom, and the theme is anything in that's pertaining to agency and responsibility. And so we're really looking for people across the disciplines that are interested in these issues. And then the papers are collected every other year and published in the Oxford Studies of Agency and Responsibility.
So last year or the last time was the one on Strawson, or the time before?
So that turned out to be a supplemental volume that we did in between the normal biennial No War. That was it was a conference that they did at William and Mary that Neil Tognazzini and Justin Coates had put together on the 50th anniversary of the article Freedom and Resentment. And so we collected those papers and put them out.
Yeah,
and the third official volume the second official volume, third volume really of Oxford Studies should be out any day now. It's from the conference here in New Orleans in 2013.
Awesome. Yeah, what do you think? Oh, I know what I was going to ask. Given your, let's put it this way, Kantians, and Kant in particular, if he is a Kantian, are notorious for saying that you have to be an agent to be a person or to be worthy of moral regard. And, so we can be nice to animals and children, but we're basically doing them a favor. Or maybe because they will become fully fledged agents or something. Now, if it turns out, if we take your tripartite theory as something like you have to have these three features to a sufficient degree to be capable of fully fledged responsibility, let's say that's what it takes to be an agent. So, does that mean someone like a psychopath, in some respects, doesn't deserve moral regard? Maybe we should say they lack certain rights, or we don't have to regard them as morally on a par with regular folks who meet all three criteria.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think that's the case. It may be that certain entities are of course owed moral regard independently of whether they're capable of showing us any regard, and I think that's surely true of psychopaths and maybe some animals and children and so forth. So I wouldn't want to rest the regard that we show for others on their capacity to show regard for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a problem with babies.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's always struck me as a little much of a leap to say that to be a member of the moral community, you have to be capable, you have to have the full agential abilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, what do you think, given how you were drawn away from an actually contributing career to become a philosopher, what do you think is philosophy's role in the public sphere?
So,
I'm being nicer to lawyers than most people usually are in saying that.
So there's a variety of roles, and this may be a strange analogy at first, but bear with me.
Okay.
So philosophers are in a sense like fashion designers. So there are varieties of kinds of fashion designers. There are those who are designing for what people wear every day, and you go all the way up to haute couture, where no one wears that outrageous stuff. But nevertheless, the kinds of aesthetic ideas that are being put forward, the kinds of ideas that are being put forward in the haute couture, gradually make their way down into, in various surprising and interesting ways, into the things that people wear every day. So I think there are a variety of roles for philosophers that are mirror that aesthetic structure. That there are people who are doing kind of haute couture philosophy, purely theoretical, that in its way may filter down to more everyday concerns, where there are people obviously doing on the ground applied ethics. So the role that philosophers ought to play with respect to the public, I think, is going to depend on what it is that what interests that they have. That's not to say that they won't ever contribute to the public, even if they're doing that kind of pure theoretical stuff. But I think that we, especially those of us who are doing ethics, even if it's of a more theoretical bent, do need to speak out more because we have things to say in the public eye. And this is happening, and I'm very excited to see this happening in some of the articles in the New York Times, The Stone, and some of their op-ed pages. These things have been occurring in a way that's exciting to me, or there are various blogs that have gotten some public traction. Part of the issue is that there are certain areas in applied ethics, for example, which would be the natural zone for philosophers to contribute the most, where I think philosophers themselves view the issues in question as so settled as to not warrant, there's no need for us to talk about it. And that's just false for the general public, and I think that there could be great value in contributing what the reason why many of the philosophers think these issues are so settled to more of the public square. But
like what are you thinking of?
Well, I was thinking in particular of something that Jeff McMahon said about gun control. I mean, I think amongst philosophers, for example, this is thought to be fairly settled. Of course, there should be serious restrictions in who can own guns.
Well, amongst everybody except the United States, I think.
Well, that may well be true. And there are very good reasons for it that can be given, but as I say, lots of philosophers just think, well, there's no reason to talk about this. It seems like a dead-end issue. Or until very recently, same-sex marriage was thought to be such an obviously supportable right thing to do that amongst philosophers that people had stopped teaching it in their courses, and they were talking about how for the last 5 years, lots of people haven't even taught it anymore because they think there just aren't any good arguments on the opposing side. Well, bring those to bear to the public, and I think that could be a very valuable service. Talk about why you think all of those arguments are really bad arguments.
Don't you sometimes feel, though, that arguments are never going to do anything? It's what changed things in now. Gay marriage is one of those things that amazes people of our generation because it happened so fast. I mean, when I was in graduate school, when I was a TA, the idea of gay marriage becoming legal within 20 or 30 years would have been bewildering. But and I think it's more to do with social media, reality TV, stuff like. I think, like for example, on the one hand, it seems kind of obnoxious that Caitlyn Jenner is getting all this press because I mean, haven't we had enough of the Kardashians, and now we have to respect one of them? I mean, but that's how progress gets made, is in these ways that's, to a philosopher, seems infuriating because it's like, but we've been talking about this for centuries, and now suddenly you catch on because it affects one of the Kardashians.
Right.
But that's how progress is made.
That's right. No, you're exactly right. And so this is where philosophers are not fully aware or take sufficient consideration of the way in which social change is affected. That social change is not generated typically by argument and argument alone. And this is maddening to people. I mean, on the same-sex issue, for example, what finally changed people's minds was more people coming out who were their family members. And so so you get Republican politicians saying things like, oh, well, I was against it until I saw that my son or son-in-law was gay.
Which in itself is maddening. But
it's incredibly maddening. And so what I'm trying to do in the classroom is to teach people not to rely on that kind of change in attitude, but to be able to assess the arguments for things independently of those kinds of attitudes that we might have. Independently of those kind of affections that we might or might not have, because you may not know anybody who's of an oppressed minority, but nevertheless you ought to be able to recognize that they ought not be oppressed. And so, and I've done a kind of change in my own view on this in the last year or so. When it comes to public policy, the reasons that we think are relevant or irrelevant, that's not the way public policy change is generally affected. And so I think in order to have more of a voice in the public square, we have to recognize that change is incremental typically, although the same-sex marriage case is a radical exception to that. As you say, it blew my mind. But most change is fairly incremental. The conservative, however bizarrely some policy has come into effect, as most of our policies are, it's typically a result of crazy history and negotiation between parties and legislators and so forth. We have to recognize that that's the case. For example, that there are no good reasons that differentiate drug use from alcohol use, right? For why one should be legal and one isn't. Nevertheless, that's the case. And so if you want to change drug policy, you have to start with that recognition. You can't say, well, look, there's no distinction here between alcohol and drugs. That's for a variety of crazy reasons, drugs have become prohibited, and so you have to start with that fact and try to move from there to if you're going to want to go for a more open policy. So it's a very different set of reasons, I think, that are relevant in the public square. Philosophers typically don't want to engage with those kinds of reasons because they don't think that they're relevant. And if we are to affect kind of social policy change, we have to recognize those.
Are there any radically different areas of philosophy that you intend to explore? I mean, is there some thing that maybe when you're teaching 101 and you say, oh, I always thought this was cool and I've never had a chance to really explore it?
I've been interested in philosophy of religion for years and have never really written anything about it.
Now, there's an area where, you actually get people, intellectual figures becoming famous, sometimes the wrong ones, like Sam Harris and, but still, there's a debate that seems to be happening, or at least has been happening over the past decade.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and I've been somewhat encouraged and somewhat discouraged by the tenor of that debate. But nevertheless, it's something that might be worth pursuing. Although I don't know about that. But so
you kind of see what happens though to these intellectuals that enter the public sphere.
Yeah, that's right.
Suddenly it becomes about their personality, or
that's right.
and then I mean even someone like a lefty-leaning website like Salon.com runs all these salacious things about what the new atheists don't understand about religion and things like this. So It's like, so you can't make it just about issues. You have to be prepared, I guess, if you're going to be a public intellectual.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, some of them are doing a decent job at it, but you're taking quite a bit on when you do that, and it's not. You'd have to prepare yourself well, I think, and
watch what you say, which Dawkins doesn't seem very good at.
That's right.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much. Now, of course, there's a ton more to be said about the subject of your book, but we are limited in time and reliability of your power source. So.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was great. Thank you.
I appreciate it, Simon. Yeah, I really appreciate it. That was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks.
All right. I'll see you.
See ya.